My talk today is entitled Forest Carbon Markets, with a large focus on NCX, the Natural Capital Exchange Forest Carbon Program or Market. So to begin, what are forest carbon markets? Well, these are carbon offset markets that allow landowners to sell the carbon being sequestered by their forest to another entity to compensate for that entity's emissions of carbon or greenhouse gas beyond some minimum cap during the production process of that industry. Forest carbon offset projects can include improved forest management practices, avoided deforestation, or tree planting. And obviously, this forest carbon, selling the forest carbon sequestered to offset the emissions of another industry, provides an additional source of income to forest landowners beyond, say, traditional timber markets like pulpwood, chip and saw logs. And there's even a long-term commitment to keep forests intact. So there's two main types of markets: compliance and voluntary. And here we're mainly talking about NIPF, non-industrial private forest landowners, and family forest owners. So we're going to talk about voluntary. But briefly about compliance. So generally, compliance markets are for those larger, generally public land bases. Why? Because once again, you guys remember I said these offset projects, these offset markets, right? Some industries emitting carbon or greenhouse gases beyond some cap, and they got to buy carbon sequester, buy credits from another person who's sequestering carbon to offset that. And therefore, these people that are buying these credits, right, this industry, they need to have a long-term source of carbon sequestration, and they need to have a large amount of acreage of that. And that needs to be dependable. So a lot of times these are longer contract lengths. There's enrollment and inventory cost often, but the people selling the carbon will have a higher carbon credit revenue. With voluntary markets, right, a lot of times they're not as dependable as the compliance. These are generally landowners like 1,000 acres or less, 500 acres or less, family forest owners here, say in Mississippi. And they're not as dependable, right? Because a lot of times these landowners, right, they're not really, they're going to play the markets, the chip and saw timber, the chip and saw pulpwood and sawlog market. So their amount of carbon is not really sequestered, is not really dependable over time, and they don't have large acreages, each one of them, so there's transaction fees. But generally then, there's shorter contract lengths, which is great for the landowners, but the landowners receive a lower carbon credit revenue per credit. And here's just the summary of some of the majority of the available forest carbon markets. And you can see the contract lengths are rather long for several of these, especially when you're talking about the forested conditions we have here, particularly like, say, loblolly pine plantations, which generally are probably going to have at most like a 35-year rotation, 40 maybe, but generally 25 to 35. So a lot of these are not, and then your minimum acreages, you guys, 5,000 acres in the California cap and trade, and there's restrictions on harvesting. So a lot of these are not really applicable to NIPF, family forest landowners here in Mississippi. They're more applicable to the west or the north, where they have a lot of different, they have a little different land base. They have more public land, more federal and large state-owned acreages. So we're going to talk about today NCX, right, Natural Capital Exchange. 1-year contract lengths, there's no minimum to enroll, but there is a minimum to participate. And you technically can't harvest during that 1-year contract period, but it's only a 1-year contract period, so you can harvest fairly regularly if you want to. As I mentioned earlier, there's types of forest carbon offset projects. How do we get an additional amount of carbon being sequestered on the landscape? Well, that's through afforestation, reforestation. Say, right after a clear cut, somebody replants, or say an old an agricultural field is converted back over the trees, or a parking lot, and they tear up the pavement and they replant trees. Avoided conversion, like, this is probably good, like in Houston or Atlanta, where you have a lot of forest land right on kind of that wild and urban interface, and right, so kind of getting these subdivisions or malls there. And so maybe this landowner says, you know what, I want to keep my trees, but I also want somebody to pay that for me. So these carbon markets will pay that landowner some amount of money for the carbon being sequestered because they didn't convert. They avoided that conversion. Then improving forest management activities, right? Better yields generally, say like fertilization or planting of different species or different genetic stock. And then to me, there's almost a fourth, all right? And this is deferment of harvesting activities, and this is NCX, everybody. And where they're going to pay you, they're going to give you credit for the amount of carbon that you're sequestering on your forest because you deferred a harvest. You should have harvested, or that landowner, I should say, should have harvested, but they didn't because they enrolled into the market. And so therefore there's this fourth type, right? You can get an additional amount of carbon being sequestered on the landscape because that forest was never thinned or clear cut. So I'm going to talk about additionality and business as usual, and you may have heard of these two concepts. And you could talk about BAU first or additionality first and vice versa. I'm going to talk about additionality first. They're highly related to one another. So NCX states, and this really applies to almost all the forest carbon markets, this general concept, but they state a key feature of calculating the impact of a forest carbon project is a concept called additionality. For forest carbon projects to affect real change on the landscape, we need to know what would have happened if the project did take place. If there was no NCX there, what would happen, generally for that landowner? So without a realistic BAU, business as usual assessment, strategies run the risk of adverse selection, where payments are made to landowners to behave in ways that they might have behaved already, and so forth. So to me, in layman's terms, what this is saying, everybody, is that the amount of carbon being sequestered, say over this next year in NCX or into the future, is resulting from the directly resulting from the enrollment in that carbon market. So if a landowner wasn't going to harvest anyways, right, with NCX because they're deferred harvest, right? If a landowner wasn't going to harvest anyways, and they enrolled in NCX, should NCX pay them money for the amount of carbon being sequestered in that forest over the next year? That amount of carbon was going to be sequestered regardless of whether that landowner enrolled in the NCX or not, right? So the fact that that landowner enrolled in NCX, that additional amount of carbon is not really additional or directly resulting from the enrollment in the NCX. So carbon sequestration due to a practice activity or the lack of a practice, right, activity, the deferring of a harvest, that would not have occurred without the market. So if there was no NCX, right, this person, if they could have harvested, they would have. But now they're going to defer because they're into NCX. And thus that additional amount of carbon, or I should say that carbon sequestration on the landscape over the next year is now additional, resulting from their enrollment into this carbon market. So essentially, if there was no carbon market, NCX paying you to defer a harvest or a landowner to defer a harvest, would that landowner have had the ability to conduct the harvest? If that answer is no, for whatever reason that may be, then by that landowner not harvesting a forest due to entering into the market at a particular time is not really deferring anything. Hence, the additional production in carbon, say, over the next year is not really additional resulting from this market. Once again, everybody, right? The landowner wasn't going to be able to harvest anyways. So therefore, they enroll in NCX and say, I want to be paid for the additional amount of carbon being sequestered in my forest. But that's not really benefiting NCX because that amount of carbon was going to be sequestered whether or not they enrolled or not. So it's not really additional. And I'm going to talk here briefly about when that could occur. But if the answer is yes, and then by a landowner entering into the market, that landowner defers a harvest, the amount of carbon produced over the next year, right, that's resulting directly from that landowner's enrollment in the NCX. That amount of carbon sequestered would not have occurred without that landowner enrolling in NCX, and therefore that landowner should receive some credit for that additional amount of carbon being sequestered on the landscape. So why could you potentially not defer a harvest? Well, let's say perhaps traditional markets provide such low stumpage values that a landowner is unwilling to sell, and I see that a lot, everybody. I don't want to give my timber away. The pulpwood markets are like $1 or $2 a ton. I don't want to give it away. Right? So then they say, well, I'm going to go enroll in NCX and get paid for that amount of carbon that I'm going to get, I'm going to produce here over the next year, sequester over the next year. Well, not really, right? Because you weren't going to harvest anyways. You did not have the ability to harvest. Therefore, the amount of carbon sequestered is not additional, resulting directly from you enrolling in the NCX. Or perhaps there's not a logging infrastructure, or there's a limited amount of mills. You have a perfect forest biologically, but there's no mills within a reasonable distance given cost of logging or harvesting. So therefore you can't harvest. Once again, everybody, that's not the amount of carbon being sequestered, then what's going to happen whether or not that landowner enrolls in the NCX. Or the site is far from paved roads, or road infrastructure is limiting, or say you have a small acreage, and we see this a lot, and thus given your market conditions, the availability of loggers is really restrictive. So let's say a landowner's got 20 acres, okay? Right now, right, generally we talk about loggers got to have about 40 acres to come out and justify bringing all that equipment onto that landowner's property. There's a lot of cost involved in that, right? Kind of economy of scale. Nowadays, with inflation and fuel, and it's probably even 50 or 60 acres, right? So let's say this landowner's got 20 acres, and they weren't going to be able to harvest it because no logger is going to come out. So therefore, they enroll in NCX and they expect payment for the amount of carbon being sequestered over the next year. Well, once again, NCX is going to say no. Business as usual, you were not going to be able to harvest anyways. Therefore, the amount of carbon being sequestered over this next year in your forest is not additional, resulting directly from your enrollment into NCX. And then leads us then to BAU, right? Business as usual. And you can hopefully see the direct, the high relationship between BAU and additionality. In order to say that carbon being sequestered is additional due to the market, you got to know the business as usual activity. So this refers to the BAU case of a landowner's annual harvest activity, in which no payments are made to defer harvest activity, and no harvesting activity is deferred. So what would that landowner be able to do in terms of harvesting if NCX was not here? And that's kind of the business as usual. And that obviously is, conceptually, is very easy. You just, what would that landowner be able to do? But obviously it's very hard to read a landowner's mind. So hopefully this is kind of give you some idea of what we're talking about with BAU. This is a loblike pine plantation, right? Generally, right, age and then basal area per acre, 4.5 feet as that stand develops. Right, you plant here at year 0, and what happens? Well, that forest grows, right? Then at some point, let's say age 15, just for illustrative purposes, right, there starts to be intense competition for light, moisture, and nutrients. So a landowner's going to what? They're going to thin, okay? That's business as usual. Business as usual, they're going to thin. Right? Then they're going to let it grow out. Back at age 21, once again, you guys, kind of, right, gets to be intense competition for limited site resources, moisture, nutrient, and light. They're going to thin, right? Then they're going to let it grow out. They're going to what? They're going to clear cut it around 20, 29, 30. That's business as usual. Without NCX, this is what a landowner would do if they could harvest, all right? This is what they would do. So this kind of allows you then to establish a baseline of the amount of carbon being sequestered under business as usual. And therefore, any amount of carbon beyond this that's sequestered, that amount of carbon we could say is what? That would be additional resulting from some practice, and with NCX, that would be a deferred harvest. So how does NCX come up with their BAU? Well, it's obviously a little complex, but they use a predictive algorithm. And inputs to the algorithm include the sizes and species of trees, the biology. Okay, that's right. A lot of people understand that, but what a lot of people don't understand is also what goes into that BAU assessment is your location and proximity to markets, the terrain and operability, the size of your parcels. Not just your biology, your trees, but also your ability to harvest if you wanted to, okay, biologically or economically. Meaning, yes, as I've already mentioned, right? You only have 20 acres, so no logger is going to come out. There's no mills near you, okay? So there's no logger, right? You can't really sell your timber, even though you got great stuff biologically. There's no timber, and you see that out west, like in parts of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Wyoming. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, they've lost their mills. So really, there's right. So any landowner that's got an excellent ponderosa pine stand enrolls in the NCX, and they expect to get paid for the carbon sequester next year. Well, no, because that landowner wasn't going to be able to harvest anyways. Remember, NCX is going to pay you for deferring a harvest, additional amount of carbon being sequestered on the landscape resulting from the deferment of a harvest. So a lot of landowners don't understand that. But it's a function of the biology. And here, this is from Minnesota, and I just put the Minnesota in here so I didn't get anybody upset about oak and pine, okay? So this is cedar and this is maple, and you can see there's different carbon production as you go up through time and with increases in diameter. So there's species, right? Sizes and species, sizes of trees and species, okay? That play a factor into the amount of credit that the landowner is going to get, as well as, here's Mississippi. That's kind of a little bit more hardwood, but certainly pine up there, and then this is your big pine region with some hardwood, and then here's your delta, right, your hardwood. So all of this is going to play a factor into the amount of carbon you're going to sequester and the amount of credits you're going to get. But also, as I said, everybody, the amount of your ability to harvest, the probability of you going to be able to harvest. And that's a little bit tricky to explain here, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. And then, based on the business as usual and whether or not the amount of carbon being sequestered over the next year is additional or not, NCX assigns a harvest deferral credit for the amount of carbon being sequestered in the landowner's forest over the next year. And then that then determines the payment that landowner is going to get. So we can go back to this business as usual, this log pine plantation, right? Remember, this is BAU. You plant, you let it grow, then you thin, right? Then you thin again, and then you clear cut, okay? And so when would a landowner receive credit for the amount of carbon being sequestered in this pine plantation due to the NCX market? Well, right here, right? So you plant and you grow. Now this right here, you guys, carbon's being sequestered here, right? But is it additional? It's not additional because why? The landowner had no ability to harvest here anyways, economically, right? So here, this is where you can start to get a harvest deferral credit. You should then, but what? You don't, because you enrolled in the NCX. You're going to sequester carbon over the next year, an additional amount of carbon over if you thinned, and therefore you should receive some credit for that. Same thing here at age 21, right? You should have thinned, you didn't. Therefore, this amount of carbon being sequestered over this next year, resulting directly from you deferring that harvest because you entered in the NCX, you should receive some credit for that. Out here too, everybody, right? This is additional. You should clear cut at age 28, but you don't. You let it grow out another year, you sequester an additional amount of carbon on the landscape resulting directly from your enrollment in the NCX. You should receive some credit for that. And you can do it a second year and so forth. So that's kind of that additionality and business as usual, two big concepts with carbon markets. So let's talk a little bit more here about NCX. So contract length of 1 year, as I've already stated. There's no fees to participate, no fees for the inventory, and there's no minimum acreage to enroll. There is some to participate, and I'm going to talk about that here briefly. But here is November 2021, and you can see there's 2.35 million acres, 670 landowners, so there was some participation. And then you can see that it's kind of gradually going up. And this is as of last week. This is the most current that they have. So you can see there's more and more landowners enrolling and participating, and that's great. NCX is not targeting those large public landowners like the compliance markets. They're targeting the smaller 500 or less, maybe 1,000 or less too, right? But generally 500 or less acre NIPF, family forest landowners. And they're gonna get a lot of them and kind of almost do the same thing that these compliance markets do with a fewer landowners but large land bases, right? So NCX is a voluntary carbon market. Why? I think we've all seen a rise once again in environmentalism, global warming, climate change. Whether or not you agree with it politically or whatever, that's a fact. It is, these markets are out there. There's very few to no fees. Measurements costs paid by NCX. Contract duration for 1 year. Plantations are eligible. Some markets they're not. You can conduct thinnings, but you're going to receive a reduced payment. And if you think your landowner is going to thin over the next year or clear cut over the next year, don't enroll, because that could cause you some issues with re-enrolling. So try to factor that out when you're looking at your land base. HDC is the unit of transaction, harvest deferral credit. Now here's a big one that some people don't understand. There's no minimum acreage to enroll, but there is a minimum acreage to participate. You have to have at least 5 harvest deferral credits worth of carbon across your property to participate. And that's usually around 15 to 20 acres depending on the forest type. Why, everybody? It's almost like when you go to the gas station and they got a minimum credit card charge of $3 or $5, right? And I go up there and I buy a 5-cent piece of candy and I say I want to charge it on a credit card. Well, that transaction fee with that credit card is probably more than the amount of money they're going to receive off that sale, that 5-cent piece of candy. Same thing here, everybody. The landowner's not paying any measurement costs or transaction fees or enrollment fees, right? But somebody is, right? Probably the buyers, okay? In the market, the NCX, right? So they don't want 1 million or 2 million landowners like myself with a half acre in my yard enrolling. And then they got to make these transactions between the buyer and these, half acre sellers, and right, because there's money and there's costs involved in doing the measurements and the transaction fees. So they have to have some kind of economy of scale, and that to me is kind of where that minimum 5 HDC comes from. But nonetheless, NCX is advantageous relative to other carbon markets. There's a few issues, so mostly in order to prevent leakage. If you heard of that, I haven't had time to get into that today. The landowners got to enroll their whole property, and sometimes they don't like that. There's not a entirely clear concept of BAU, but that's getting better, as you can imagine. And everybody, I think you would know, these carbon markets are evolving, and that's kind of an issue. They're evolving, right? Over 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years of the timber markets, chip and saw, sawlog, pulpwood, how they've evolved from cords and volume, board feet to tons, you know what I mean, right? So these carbon markets are evolving. So that's getting better. What is an HDC is a little bit tricky to talk about. I just mentioned that minimum acreage, right? That you got to have that minimum acreage. There's no minimum acreage to enroll, but there's some minimum acreage to participate. And then landlords will receive reduced payments for thinnings and final clear cuts, mortality, say from prescribed burns or natural disasters. NCX wisely pays you at the end of the year. So they're only going to pay you in the amount of carbon that you deliver. And that's good. It's good for you and good for them, because what's good is with NCX, relative like CCX, if you remember Chicago Climate Exchange, landowners had to pay upfront fees to enroll, to inventory, and let's say you have a hurricane or a SPB, Southern Pine Beetle, come through and wipe out your forest. Well, you're out. Not only are you out the carbon credit payments, you're also out that inventory fee, the enrollment fee. So they're just, NCX is really good because you're not going to be out of much outside of just the carbon credit that you were going to receive, which can be annoying too, but at least you're not out any upfront costs like some of the other carbon markets. Generally, most folks I've talked to receive from around $5 to $10 per acre, sometimes as high as $20 per acre, right? They're probably going to have certain forest types that are high quality site, they're yielding, they're sequestering a lot of carbon. Generally, I talk about acre rather than HDCs. But, right, so you're not going to get rich off of this, okay? But I certainly would encourage landowners, forest landowners, regardless if you have 1 acre or 300 acres, go ahead and enroll. Just see what they say, right? The only thing I would say, though, is I tell landowners all the time, make sure you do not forget active forest management, meaning if you can thin or clear cut, get that money. You're talking $5 to $10 an acre versus what? Isn't 100 tons times 20 tons? Versus $2,000 an acre, okay, when you're clear cutting a sawlog stand, roughly, right? So my point is don't be trying to get money here, and then you're gonna increase your chance of a tornado or a hurricane coming through and wiping out your forest. The other thing too is, right, whenever you're thinning or you're clear cutting, that's pretty much perfect conditions for the southern pine beetle. So it's definitely worth the landowner's ability to look at it. And then there's some landowners that they don't mind that risk, okay? They're willing to accept the risk of losing their forest. And for those landowners, that's fine. But I just tell landowners, make sure you fully understand what you're getting into when you enroll into NCX or any other forest carbon market. Thank you.